What's your name again, darling?
Sarah Nelson.
Sarah. It's a lovely name. How are we doing?
Tide's out, Mr. Knight, George.
Ah, well.
There's a bloke downstairs, he wants to talk to you.
Now, what's what, fucking crip?
No, he wants to talk to you.
Has he got a name?
Muller. He's full of beans, but I reckon we can handle him.
Yeah, I know him, Jackie Muller. I'll tell him to get fucked.
You leave my daughter alone, you filthy bastard!
Hello, Jackie. How you going, old son? He's right. Mr. Muller he's here to pay his respects, aren't you, Jackie?
Respects? Hell'll be the day, you bludger. If I hear you even whispering again to my daughter, I kill you, Freeman.
Oh, do you hear that, boys? Jackie Muller's threatening to kill me. Come here. Now, for starters, she's not your daughter. She's your stepdaughter.
She's just a kid, Freeman. Leave her alone.
I didn't lay a finger on her, Jackie. Well, maybe one finger, but she didn't seem to mind at the time.
You touch her again, I'll kill you.
Now, take this fuck-knuckle downstairs. Give him a tap on the way out.
You're a dead man, Freeman. Now, fuck off! This is for you, Freeman. You'll have to depend on that, you hear me? You'll have to be a lot fucking smarter to get rid of George Freeman!
Meet George Freeman, race fixer, casino king, organised crime boss and cold-hearted executioner. Tonight we uncover the facts behind the fiction and meet the real George Freeman, the King of Sydney. Born in tough inner-city Sydney, George David Freeman fought his way up from the slums to become head of a multi-million-dollar organised crime syndicate. Freeman lived the life of a Hollywood gangster, paying off police and politicians to cover his back and consistently denying any involvement in crime, despite a life lived on the wrong side of the law. Tonight, through dramatised scenes, expert analysis and first-hand accounts, we reveal the self-styled lucky gambler to be a cold, calculating killer whose reign over Sydney's underworld was only ended by his death.
George Freeman was a crime lord, he ran SP, he was a racketeer, and he did whatever was necessary to get a quid.
He wanted to be a crook. That was his ambition. He ended up becoming a gangster, which took him much beyond most of his peers.
Freeman was a person who people looked up to, they respected. He was like a godfather of organised crime in Sydney.
He sent me a message once, and it's like something out of The Godfather. He actually sent someone to throw petrol over our pet cat and set it alight.
He was a man that had considerable influence on the Sydney scene. I think that they were far better organised than what the American Mafia was. And they just got rid of anyone that threatened their scene. And that was George.
Freeman was an ambitious man, writing in his autobiography of his plan to be not just any crook, but the crook, the biggest, the man with the power and influence. Freeman certainly achieved his dream. By the time of his death, he was the National Crime Authority's #1 target, and despite being investigated for bribery, corruption, illegal gambling, tax evasion and murder, he managed to avoid any major charges. As well as Freeman's activities in organised crime, he was also a gambler with a reputed 98% success rate, thanks no doubt to his involvement in race fixing, horse doping and standing over jockeys. He always knew the odds in every situation, but on the evening of Anzac Day in 1979, Freeman was caught by surprise. His nemesis from the press, legendary investigative journalist Bob Bottom, takes up the story.
The night George Freeman got shot, I got a call. As soon as the police were told, I was told, because George Freeman had appeared in a Sunday paper just a week or two before, vowing that I'd die before he died. So police went to the hospital to try and talk to George. But let me tell you, one of the first things they did, they sent out 2 police to guard my house in case any word was given under George's threat.
Rumours quickly spread through the underworld that Muller had shot Freeman to warn him away from his stepdaughter, Lena Hurley.
Jackie Muller, and this is just according to the story around at the time, had told George to keep away from his stepdaughter.
You leave my daughter alone, you filthy bastard!
Anyway, George continued to see her because he was that sort of guy. You know, who do you think you are telling me not to see someone I want to see?
Now take this fuck-knuckle downstairs. Give him a tap on the way out.
You're a dead man, Freeman.
Jack made up his mind that George had done something pretty bad and confronted him.
This is for you, Freeman.
Unfortunately for the shooter, he didn't kill Freeman, and Freeman knew who he was. Muller would have realised he was in trouble. His problem was, I guess, is there anything I can do to resolve this matter? And the answer was, no, just wait until your time comes. He had 6 weeks to wait.
And if you're not fucking smart enough to get rid of George Freeman!
And according to the story that I was told, Muller was in his home at Randwick. He was induced to come out and he was shot in the driveway of his home, allegedly by Stan Smith.
Virtually no evidence to tie George Freeman up with that shooting, but there's every likelihood that he was responsible for it.
It's amazing that exactly 6 weeks later, poor old Jackie Muller lay dead. God rest his soul.
Forensic psychologist David Mutton believes Freeman would have been driven to kill Jackie Muller by more than just revenge.
He has to show the rest of the world that he is not as vulnerable as that attack might have suggested. So he has to be able to exact very swift justice to show the world that he is reasonably invulnerable, that he is very powerful.
The fact of the matter is that any sane man who knows how to work the numbers knows that he has to make himself safe. And the easiest way to make himself safe is to send 2 messages at once. To the person who's done the deed, you ain't going to do it again because you're dead. And to everybody else who's thinking about it, think again.
And he would have made sure this alibi was watertight. But everyone would have known that Jackie Muller was a dead man as soon as George survived the shooting.
Pretty lucky miss. Do you think they meant to kill him?
You think they meant to kill me? Well, I'll show you the clothes I shot in. See what you think.
In an interview for ABC TV, Freeman showed off his bloody clothes from the shooting.
George would have been personally affronted by the fact that someone could, 1, get to him this way, and 2, almost kill him.
The new pants that night.
The fact that he survived also perhaps suggests an immortality, so it's actually quite a powerful symbolic message in 2 fashions. One, I've survived, and one, you won't.
Just 6 weeks after shooting Freeman, Muller was executed with 3 shots to the head. Freeman was conveniently in Noosa and always denied any involvement in the murder. However, a message had been sent loud and clear to the rest of the underworld: don't mess with George Freeman. Freeman was born on January the 23rd, 1935, in the inner city Sydney suburb of Annandale. As Freeman would later write, the family lived in poverty and he and his siblings slept on mats in the hall. Life was hard and got even tougher when his father, William, abandoned the family when Freeman was just 4 years old. Freeman described the hardships of his early childhood in his autobiography.
And there were just 2 tiny bedrooms, kitchen and laundry. Oh, you know, dunny at the back. No hot water at all except what Mum boiled up on the stove.
Annandale was a great place to live, but it was full of knockabouts, ex-soldiers, wharfies, SP bookmakers. It was typical inner-city living, but it produced people like Darcy Dugan and a variety of criminals who went on to be at the top level of their chosen occupation. But it was a hard area.
Freeman was born in Annandale and grew up in a deprived childhood. It was a very big family, and his father deserted them at a very early age. The mother remarried a few years later, but the stepfather died as well, causing the family greater financial hardship. But it was that early childhood, the suffering and pain and being without guidance, that more or less dominated George's life afterwards.
Psychologists agree the loss of two father figures in quick succession and a childhood scarred by poverty would have had a significant impact on the young Freeman.
When you've got a woman who has suffered two significant losses, what's she likely to be as a mother? Probably fairly depressed, fairly withdrawn, again showing a lack of oversight to his care.
So he's grown up without much in the way of male role models. He's grown up also with a sense of unpredictability in his life. These were difficult times. Firstly, the economic conditions, the Depression had only just finished, and then you got more or less rolled up into World War II. There would have been problems with finances and problems with being able to get the basic resources and the basic needs met.
He found a little niche, starting off in crime, and maybe he thought that crime was to actually help his mother.
Freeman's attempt to support his family quickly got him into trouble. At age just 12, he landed his first conviction for theft. By 16, Freeman was incarcerated for breaking and entering and spent 2 years in the brutal Tamworth and Gosford boys' homes. Both institutions were famed for their violence and cruelty.
George turned to a life of crime pretty early, and as a consequence, he finished up in boys' homes, including Mount Penang on the central coast of New South Wales, a terribly brutal place anyway, and it didn't pull any punches with George. He was physically and sexually abused there.
It's a very brutal environment. Back in those days, it was seen as quite okay for the older boys to harm these younger kids in all sorts of ways, sexual, physical, the lot.
They were Dickensian houses of horror, those boys' homes. He writes in his own book that it was just a joke that anyone could come out of there not full of hate and violence, and he certainly did.
Small in stature and an asthmatic, Freeman must have struck a timid figure, for he was quickly nicknamed Mouse and suffered sexual abuse and physical violence during the 2 years he was incarcerated.
I guess all the implications of that emotional numbing, again, when you've been sexually abused as a male or a female, he carries with him. And he seems to have made a decision, I'm never going to be put into that position again.
He's learning that you've got to look after number one. He's learning that authority can be quite cruel.
George had a streak of violence in him. He had that capacity to strike back. He wouldn't just walk away. He'd learnt that in boys' homes and being beaten by police and warders and so forth, sadists basically. So, as so often happens, he turned that back on the world once he re-emerged.
Freeman emerged an angry young man, no doubt haunted by what he'd experienced. He also appeared determined to leave his past as a victim behind him, and he would never again tolerate being called Mouse.
For you, mate. That one was for you.
Smart-ass bastard.
Oh, that's straight out of the middle. This is getting too easy, boys. So who wants to be my next victim? What about you, Freeman?
Yeah, I'll have a crack.
No way, I hit it.
Bull's ass you did, that's out.
Fuck off, I hit it.
Like hell you did, you're out.
Go to buggery, Freeman. I hit it.
You did not, give me the bat.
No way. Go back and bowl the ball, Mouse.
What'd you call me?
Mouse. That's what they call you in reform school, wasn't it? Hey? Fucking Mouse.
Stick it up your ass, mate.
Oh, you'd know all about that, wouldn't you, Freeman? Huh, is that why they called you Mouse? Big boys worried you were gonna run up the leg of their trousers.
Stop it! No! Leave him. Call me that again and see what happens. Any of yous, just try and see what happens.
I grew up Young Street, Annandale, which is the same street that George Freeman was from. Even in those days, George was a little fellow, but with an extreme propensity for violence. In fact, my brother told me a story that they used to play street cricket.
No way, I hit it.
And so Freeman had already done a bit of time at Mount Penang and what have you.
Go back and bowl the ball, Mouse.
What'd you call me?
Mouse. That's what they call you in reform school, wasn't it?
He attacked this other kid who was bigger and fatter than he was. and then proceeded to drive his head into the gutter to the point that the other kids stopped him because they feared that he would have killed him.
Georgie!
Even back then, he was just a vicious little turd, you know.
Psychologists believe Freeman's treatment in the boys' homes was what drove him to behave so violently.
If he did experience the sexual violence in Mount Penang, then we might suggest that he could be suffering from something called post-traumatic stress disorder. We know, though, that people who do have this disorder tend to cut loose in many ways and they can overreact in many regards. Combine that with an environment where aggression and violence and lack of control is the currency, then you can see a fairly explosive mix there.
The other thing about it is that their size probably does matter because you're going to fight harder the bigger they are because you have to win.
That's what a lot of those boys' homes did in those days. They taught you how to survive.
Call me that again and see what happens. Any of yous. Just try and see what happens.
Freeman rapidly gained a fearsome reputation for his violent behaviour. Freeman's vicious streak more than made up for his small stature, and he quickly became a sought-after bodyguard who provided protection for well-heeled gamblers, illegal bookmakers and casino operators. However, Freeman was a failure as a crook and repeatedly got caught. Less than a year after being released from Gosford Boys' Home, he did his first stint in an adult prison and spent his 20s in and out of jail, serving time at Long Bay, Bathurst, Berrima, Parramatta and Grafton jails for various petty offences.
George's early career gave no indication really of what he would become because, frankly, as a criminal, he was inept. He had a string of firearm offences against him. He couldn't burgle a house without being caught. Everything he tried as a criminal was a disaster. He had this continual record of violence and lack of success. And in fact, even in the late 60s, he was still a very unsuccessful criminal in that he was working at the abattoirs as a meat cutter. So he certainly hadn't hit great heights by then.
He wasn't what you would call in the creme de la creme of criminals. He was a bit of a loser and decided, obviously, to take another path and got into SP bookmaking, and I must say he became quite successful at it.
Even Freeman recognised that something had to change. Writing years later,
I had to start getting more successful. To be honest, I was less than a successful crook. My only reward had been jail and plenty of it.
the change Freeman needed came in the form of established Sydney hardman Lenny McPherson. The two men met in Long Bay Jail and quickly became firm friends.
McPherson was, I think, about 10 years older than Freeman. And so there would have, when they met in jail, McPherson would have again been seen as somewhat a more experienced father figure. Freeman himself would have been looking for some help. And certainly McPherson was a more experienced person and would have provided that opportunity for the broadening of the careers.
They were very similar. Their whole evolution was very similar. They profited very similarly when they got on the top of the underworld rather than go out robbing people and whatnot. And he believed Lenny helped set him up.
Freeman's new friend, Lenny McPherson, was an ambitious criminal, aligned with enforcer Stan Smith and Sydney's first true godfather, Frederick Paddles Anderson. McPherson was trying to build his own criminal organisation that mirrored the American mafia. Spotting Freeman's natural talent as a gambler, McPherson made his move.
You fucking beauty! Huh? That's 4 in a row, George. You are on fire, son.
It always looked a good thing.
Why does a bloke who knows so much about the nags keep getting pinched for shoplifting and doing burgs and shit,
Just trying to turn a quid, Len.
You can turn more than a quid on the GGs, mate.
Oh, yeah, I go right there.
I'm talking about the SP you deal. You'll make a bomb.
Oh, nah, mate, I'm just a punter.
Look, son, you get on the SP, the world will be your fucking oyster. You mark my words.
Mate, I couldn't bear all the bad debts and hard luck stories, you know? I just want to bet and win.
You let me take care of the bad debts and the hard luck. No one says they can't pay me. No one unless they want to keep themselves in one piece.
Thanks, mate. Oh, I'd need a big wedge to kick off. I'd hate to not be able to pay some punch that gets lucky, you know?
Why the fuck are you talking about wedge, son? Hey? There you go. That'll cover your start-up cost. You tell me what else you need.
I don't want to be beholden, you know. I reckon I'm better off just puttering along on my own.
Pig's ass you are. I'll pay for your setup. I'll put you in touch with the high rollers.
SP, eh? And you got a point there.
Hitch yourself to my star, son. You'll never look back.
Well, the story goes that Lenny McPherson told George that he wasn't the very best of criminals. He was always getting caught and he should seek another career path, and suggested to him that he was quite good in the horse racing game, that he should take on SP bookmaking.
You can turn more than a quid on the GGs, mate.
Oh, yeah? I go all right there.
I'm talking about the SP, you deal. You'll make a bomb.
And as it turned out, it was extremely good advice.
Not only was McPherson about 10 years older than him, but you had this more imposing figure who had this appearance of toughness, of character, and had a much broader education. So you can see Freeman saying, I can learn some stuff from this guy. He's a couple of steps ahead of me and where I want to be in the world of gangsters.
I'll pay for your setup. I'll put you in touch with the high rollers.
SP, eh?
Psychologists agreed that for Freeman, who'd lost both his father and stepfather as a child, finding a mentor would have been a life-changing event.
It sounded like his criminality was fairly random and impulsive. McPherson offered him a structure and almost a business model by which to focus his criminal impulses.
It would have been helpful to him to have had somebody take an interest in him, particularly if the interest gave him some good advice. But the kinds of male influences he would have got from older folk, particularly having gone through Mount Penang, would have been pretty negative. This would have been something that was quite positive for him and might well have met a psychological need for him.
Freeman and McPherson joined up with feared hitman Stan Smith and became the team. They rapidly began taking over Sydney's lucrative underworld.
Stan was the guy who gave Freeman complete loyalty and a significant amount of grunt. If you walk into a room and you're chained to a 15-foot gorilla who drags his knuckles behind you, everyone notices you because the gorilla is chained and walking behind you. So Stan was a violent man. He was violent for a particular point, but Freeman used him cleverly and Stan knew how the relationship worked.
Despite the growing power of the team, Freeman always denied they were anything more than friends.
But wouldn't it be easier for you if you didn't associate with them? Then you wouldn't have this problem.
We don't associate together. We know each other. There's a little difference. Listen, but if they did ring me up tomorrow night and said, would you like to come for dinner? I'll say certainly.
Freeman's decision to join forces with McPherson and Smith would prove to be life-changing. Within a few years, he was running a syndicated SP operation that would eventually turn over millions of dollars a year. He also moved into illegal casinos, which quickly generated vast sums of cash.
When they set up shopfront casinos, they became great outlets for the so-called hoi polloi of Sydney. You'd find the barristers, judges, journalists and all sorts of people went there. So George, who'd go around and be looked upon like a king when he went in there, he made all sorts of connections.
What you find, though, is that somewhere around that mid-60 point, there was a change. He still incurred a few arrests, but they became less and less frequent. And then from about 1970, his arrests were very few and far between.
By the early 60s, Freeman was riding high, and he had found his queen, marrying his wife Marcia on the 5th of February 1963. He was also eagerly embracing his newfound wealth, compensating for the poverty of his earlier years.
George certainly spent a lot of his life trying to eradicate those ugly memories and deprivation of his childhood. He was a man who surrendered totally to consumerism. He could break a recession single-handedly. He spent so well. He wore the white suits to give the impression of being urbane, being sophisticated, and therefore divorcing himself even further from the life he'd lived as a child and as a would-be crim coming through the ranks.
He mixed with all sorts of people and had all sorts of connections, and he was very typical of some of the gangsters that he admired, and like some of them, he even lived with for a while in America, who had their mansions and whatnot, and he emulated that lifestyle.
The team prided themselves on running a slick operation and saw themselves as providing services the community wanted. They were careful strategists, keeping a low profile and covered each other's backs. Politicians and police were paid off and the cash was rolling in.
The money that poured in, not only from George's SP bookmaking rackets, but fixing races was another good earner for him. But the money he picked up just weekly from illegal casinos for the protection. Some of them used to pay up to $5,000 a week.
If they ran and dealt only with what you'd call victimless crimes, such as gambling, the casinos and so on, they believed no one was getting hurt, the community wanted it, and the politicians wouldn't pay too much attention and they could make good money without trouble. And by and large, they were right.
There is an argument that when the SP was rife, when the game was right, when the two-up was rife, Sydney was a much safer and better town than it is now, because everybody from politicians downward were getting a quid out of the illegal games.
Freeman had become a big player and as such was keenly aware his activities were being monitored. Former Assistant Commissioner Jeff Schuberg spent many years following Freeman's activities.
Over a period of 10 to 15 years, I monitored Freeman's activities. Freeman, McPherson and Smith were like brothers in those days. They communicated daily on the telephone.
One thing he told me, he said at that stage, he said, I've got a bigger listening audience than Bob Rogers or John Laws. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you don't make a phone call unless everybody knows about it, because they were tapping his phone.
When I first started looking at him, he had a fairly extensive SP network, and it was a big book. He had a lot of people that laid off with him, that he laid off with, and on some Saturdays this amounted to in excess of $1 million.
By 1974, gaming racketeers in Sydney didn't spin a wheel or deal a card without paying Freeman for the privilege, and he was regularly collecting bags of cash from casinos all over town. But as King of Sydney, Freeman was also responsible for dispensing rough justice, and in 1974, the activities of Stuart John Regan required his attention. Regan was a psychopathic killer that murdered his rivals and killed a young child in cold blood. His blatant and fearless crime spree threatened the order Freeman and the team had worked so hard to establish, and killing a child was beyond the pale.
They hated him, they feared him, they reviled him because his violence was pointless, it was directionless, it was overwhelming.
They viewed Regan as a loose cannon in a perverse sort of way, bringing discredit from the criminal element, and he just had to go.
If Regan had decided to start cleaning out his own broom closet, there's a good chance that Freeman, Stan and McPherson, all three of them, may well have been targets for Regan's interest. And to protect the rest of the organised crime group, Regan had to be removed, and it was left to the team to do that.
Freeman and Smith met with veteran crime boss Paddles Anderson and convinced him to set up and disarm the psychopathic killer.
Paddles said he'll be in about 5 minutes.
No worries. You packed?
Don't know them packed. I'm a bit toey about this. I'll give you the mail.
Easy as pie, mate. Just stand him under that light and I'll put him down.
Don't you keep me waiting. Paddles reckons he's got Regan's gun off him, and I don't trust that fucking Regan as far as I could throw him. He'll have one of his kicks somewhere.
No, mate. Paddles has shaken down 1,000 punks. He'll be clean. Money for old rope.
George, mate.
Hello, Johnny.
You're going to show me the ropes at last. Well, you know, you've been pestering me long enough. I reckon you deserve it.
Ain't that the truth?
First thing I need to do is introduce you to Stan.
Who?
Hello, Johnny.
No!
You're next, George.
Five. 6. 7. And this one's for the kid, you fucking piece of shit.
There's no doubt the demise of Regan brought about a great sigh of relief, not only amongst the police fraternity, but I would think also the criminal fraternity and the public at large.
Regan's death brought almost widespread joy in the criminal camps, because when you've got a lunatic like that running around shooting and killing indiscriminately, no one's safe.
Look carefully and see what we've done to this bloke who thought he was going to be Mr. Big. And there he is, dead in the gutter, dead on the roadway with, you know, all these holes in him, bleeding profusely.
Regan was gunned down with at least 2 separate .38 caliber guns. He was shot 8 times, taking a bullet for each of his 8 murder victims.
7. And this one's for the kid, you fucking piece of shit.
Freeman and Smith were never charged with Regan's assassination, but years later Freeman hinted at his involvement.
I received a very memorable phone call from George Freeman, among others, but particularly one in 1979. And what I always remember about this call, that George boasted to me, we haven't had any underworld hit for 5 years since the killing of Regan.
Hello, Johnny.
No!
And he told me that in the sense that, hey, you know, we're almost boasting, we're pretty well organised, you know, and that's interesting.
There was a story floating, of course, that it was Freeman that organised it, that it was Freeman that did the shooting, and this rumour started of Freeman jumping out from behind a tree, juggling 3 guns and shooting him. It cemented his reputation as the fastest man in the East, and I think he quite enjoyed it.
Psychologist Stephen Barron believes Freeman's reputation would have been enhanced by his involvement in the assassination of Regan.
He was a guy who was known as Dapper George, who would dress well, present well, knew how society worked, who was seen as being a businessman rather than being a crook. To do the dirty work on Regan, who was seen to be a sadist, a torturer, a psychopath, an evil man, would have given him a certain amount of grace.
By the mid-1970s, Freeman and the team were untouchable. Freeman's success in standing over jockeys and fixing horse races meant his SP booking operations were bringing in millions of dollars, as Freeman would later write.
The boom years of Sydney gambling couldn't last forever, but while they did, the streets of Sydney were paved with gold.
Amazing for a bloke who had such a hard upbringing. You know, they all came up in pretty tough times, and they did it hard. You've got to take your hat off to them. They got above themselves and did well for themselves.
Freeman is a bookmaker. Freeman makes his money by fixing races, bribing jockeys, making a lot of money for people by telling the people in positions of power, I fixed the race, put your money on number 3 at Rose Hill.
Freeman's friends in high places kept his back covered, and the entrenched corruption in the New South Wales system meant he was essentially untouchable.
You drive along General Holmes Drive past the airport, sitting on sometimes 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, and I used to say to my colleagues, we'd be better off locking George up for driving in a speed dangerous to the public than trying to get a brief on him with anything else, because he was protected by crooked cops. And if we ever got anything on him, then someone was helping him out and they were feeding information to him about our activities.
By the 1980s, Freeman was living large. In 1981, he married for the 2nd time to Georgina, a much younger, glamorous model. The couple had 3 children and lived a picture-perfect life in a huge mansion. But Freeman hadn't reckoned on Bob Bottom, a fearless investigative journalist determined to expose the cosy relationships between corrupt cops, politicians and crims. As a key player in Sydney's underworld, it wasn't long before Freeman was under his spotlight.
My disclosures and some of the work I did behind the scenes made it difficult for him to deal with people. He was trying to mix with politicians and people like that, and because once he came subject to the attention he did, a lot of those people were starting to cut him off, and he was very annoyed about that. He blamed me for that. George is probably one I feared the most. I can tell you that Lenny McPherson intervened a number of times. In fact, Lenny stopped Stan once too. Stan, they picked him up on phone taps, both state and federal phone taps, in 1990, going to kidnap me.
Despite all the threats made against him and his family, Bob Bottom continued his work, which finally started bringing Freeman to the attention of police. In 1983, Jeff Schuberg was part of the special gaming squad and made the momentous decision to raid Freeman's mansion. Up until then, Freeman had been untouchable.
So I organised a couple of trustworthy guys to go to his front gate, throw some dog meat over for these dogs. It wasn't the most serious offence in the world at the time, you know, starting price betting. And he went to Sutherland Court and he was convicted. He was pretty dirty about the whole thing, but he just continued to operate. This is what they used to do. You couldn't close them down, you couldn't stop them. So I decided to knock him off again. This time we thought, well, it's going to be difficult with the dogs because you'll be awake up to that. So I rang him up from a public phone box nearby and I said, George, it's Jeff Schuberg, get out and lock your dogs up straight away or we'll shoot them. He said, don't shoot the dogs. So I'll go and lock them up. And he ran out the gate, locked the dogs up, guys went in. When they walked into the room, they'd been betting, but he had all this paper and it was designed when you put in a tray of water it'd disintegrate. And they'd thrown all the betting sheets into the tray of water, everything had gone. But there was one sheet in front of George's sort of seat that still had bets on it. My mate, Bob Nicholson, was able to grab it. He had a bit of a struggle with George, who tried to jam it in a coffee cup and get rid of it. But we retrieved about 3/4 of it, put him before the court with the others. He pleaded not guilty and we convicted him again.
Outside the court, Freeman, who calls himself a commission agent, held an impromptu news conference where he claimed his arrest 3 weeks ago involved shotguns, threats against his dogs and 24 police officers.
The numbers, you know, with shotguns, I didn't like the tactical response group was there with, had shotguns to shoot me dogs.
Freeman was paying off the police, was friends with Sydney's elite and even survived Bob Bottom's prying eyes. But in the early 1980s, another problem surfaced which required his attention. Melbourne hitman Christopher Dale Flannery, a cold-hearted killer. Flannery's recklessness quickly upset the established order.
It's not something I'd readily admit to, but Flannery scared me. Anyone who wasn't scared by him didn't know the man. Flannery simply killed for money.
Aware of Flannery's grim reputation, Freeman and the team put him on their payroll. But Rent-A-Kill could not so easily be controlled.
McPherson and Freeman took Flannery under their wing, primarily as a means of trying to keep some control of him. They were aware of his reputation. They didn't want the problems he could cause in Sydney, and they figured by giving him some form of employment, they might be able to control him. The problem they had with him, though, was that he was ambitious and he wanted more. He teamed up with Nettie Smith, which was a major problem because both of them wanted to be the King of Sydney.
Flannery made enemies everywhere, but the final straw came when he attempted to murder Sydney Drug Squad detective Michael Drury in 1984. Career criminals like Freeman, who relied on corrupt police for protection, couldn't tolerate one of their associates shooting a cop. Just like Regan before him, Flannery was becoming a problem the King couldn't afford to ignore.
Flannery's as mad as a cut snake, mate. Don't you fucking give him a sniff.
Don't worry, mate. He'll be looking at his brains before he even knows what's happened.
Now listen, Stan. This is still fucking Rent-A-Kill, right?
Thanks, George. Just don't keep me waiting in that bloody cupboard. You know I don't like confined spaces.
You make sure you come out blasting.
Don't worry, mate. He won't know what hit him.
Just if you miss, mate, he'll be reaching for whatever he's got in that bloody little man bag of his, and I'm betting it's not a fucking hanky. G'day, George. G'day, Chris. Come in, mate. Good to see you.
Sorry I'm late. Fucking car wouldn't start. Had to get a cab to the airport and hire a car from there.
No worries, mate. Have a seat. Hey, you sure you don't want to drink?
No.
I tell you what, you're going to love this shooter.
Yeah, I better. Been going on about it long enough. Well, can I see it?
They make them in Israel. Fires 1,200 rounds a minute. With this in your hands, mate, you're going to be fucking invincible. And we'll settle back and live like kings.
Well, you don't look like you're doing too bad, George. So where the fuck is it?
It's just in the other room. I'll grab it.
G'day, Chris.
Jesus Christ, Stan, I told you to watch the furniture. He was fucking dead before he hit the ground. Did you have to use the entire clip?
Just making sure. Nice gun.
Flannery, like Regan, was an uncontrollable individual. He came up from Melbourne and he wanted to make a mark on the Sydney scene. I don't think he really cared what he got involved in or who he got involved with. If you had him in your camp, you couldn't trust him to sort of stay with you because he'd be just as likely to go to the opposition.
When Flannery arrived at Freeman's house for what he thought was going to be a talk about the future they could all plan together, he found a much different reception.
G'day, Chris.
He was shot dead, and the body was disposed of in the ocean.
There's no risk that his murder or disposal was approved by Lenny McPherson and Stan Smith, in concert with George Freeman. Really, it's a replica of the disposal of Stuart John Regan in the mid-70s. He got out of hand and so they just got rid of him, as they did with countless others over the years.
At the end of the day, I think George Freeman, Lenny McPherson, Stan Smith and others couldn't take the risk on this guy. He would come at them one day. He'd already shown that he was his own man. They, again played their role of unofficial policemen, the waste disposal unit, you might call it even. And it did return the underworld to a certain sense of stability that hadn't been there before during his period in Sydney.
You say you had nothing to do with his death?
I had nothing. Is he dead?
Well, I don't know.
Is he dead?
Police seem to think he might be.
And that? Well, I don't know that.
Psychologists agree that Freeman would have had no hesitation in dispensing rough justice to Flannery.
Chris had become an embarrassment, and the team had to resolve that difficulty. I don't think George had any problems with it whatsoever.
What we do with people who are threatened, we can either shoot them first off, or we invite them into our world.
G'day, George.
G'day, Chris. Come in, mate. Good to see you.
And when you invite someone into your world, you can exert power and control and influence over them. When the opportune time came, or the time was right for him to be murdered, hop, not a problem. Joyous old days.
These men live on violence. These men make profit on violence. These men see violence as being a very useful communication tool, business strategy, and an outcome which works for them. Chris Flannery, who was going to miss him? The cops weren't going to miss him.
As the 80s progressed, Freeman was arguably at the height of his power and influence. However, behind the facade of an urbane and successful player, Freeman was hiding a dark secret. For several years, he'd been fighting a losing battle with drug addiction. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, Freeman had such a chronic addiction to pethidine, a powerful painkiller, that he was listed as an approved patient to be prescribed drugs of dependence, and in fact, he was a registered addict.
He didn't like drugs, but he fell in love with pethidine, one of the drugs that can really make you feel good. And he took it initially for his asthma problems, and it just took a hold of him.
Anyone who's had a painful operation or bad breaks, I've had a few of those myself, and I've had a dose of pethidine and even a drop of morphine on the odd occasion, and gee, I could get hooked on this very easily.
Pethidine for me is an obvious choice, someone like George Freeman. It is a drug which is not tainted by the street representations or generalisations or stereotypes of street drugs. It is something that the wealthy can get hold of by virtue of going to their GP. And George Freeman would have had a ready, open supply of pethidine. Pethidine, unfortunately, has this drawback of being physically addictive. You have a physical dependence upon it over time.
Pethidine would have also helped Freeman suppress the memories of abuse he suffered as a teenager.
I think one of the most important, or the thing that we need to understand about any sort of addiction, whether it's alcohol, gambling, drugs, it is actually masking emotions.
George would have carried a lot of ghosts from his childhood and certainly his middle years, and I suspect his drug use was a way of managing that personal trauma. There are good indications he was a good family man. He certainly doted on his 2 boys. He lived in a nice big house, he provided for them well, but his addiction became a bit of a problem for him.
On March the 20th, 1990, the King of Sydney, George Freeman, finally succumbed to his chronic asthma, exacerbated by his smoking and pethidine addiction.
Go back and bowl the ball, Mouse.
What'd you call me?
Mouse. That's what they call you in reform school, wasn't it? Hey? Fucking mouse.
Look, son, you get on the SP, the world will be your fucking oyster.
SP, eh?
This one's for the kid, you fucking piece of shit.
G'day, Chris.
George? George?
You'll have to depend on that, you hear me? You'll have to be a lot fucking smarter to get rid of George Freeman.
George? George!
George Freeman, a so-called Mr. Big of the underworld, is dead. Unlike many of his associates, the Sydney racing identity died of natural causes at his home this morning. He was 55.
Freeman suffered an asthma attack at his townhouse in Sydney's south this morning. It brought on a fatal heart attack.
One of the most common reasons for overdose is because you, in fact, suppress respiration. So if he has an asthma attack and he's using pethidine, he's putting himself at risk, yeah.
When you look at the side effects of pethidine, one of the major side effects of regular use, you start feeling as if you're not getting enough air. It may well be he took to pethidine because of his asthma, or so he saw, but the pethidine had more of an effect on his respiration than the asthma did, and it killed him.
George? George!
I guess one irony in Freeman's life and death is that while in life he opposed the involvement in the illegal drug trade, not for moral reasons, but simply a belief that he could survive better in a very profitable industry without becoming involved in drugs. So it's somewhat ironic that he becomes addicted to pethidine late in his life. I guess it's one of those things, that twists of life.
About that. I don't know anything about drugs. I took a lie detector test once about it.
But see, that's the problem with an addiction. I mean, you can be thoughtful, you can be cautious, you can be safe. But once you develop an addiction and you're starting to stave off withdrawal, you do stupid things, because that's the nature of addiction.
I believed George when he told me that I was the only cop that he had ever given any assistance to with a police investigation, and he indicated that all he had ever done was pay cops for his own protection the whole of his life. I regretted his early death because I always felt that at some stage he might have been prepared to sit down with me and tell me a little bit more about that Sydney criminal milieu and hopefully tie up a few loose ends that had been sort of hanging around for years and never finalised. George and Lenny were the last of the old-time crooks, and when George went and Lenny went, there was no identifiable figure that took their place in the Sydney underworld. You know, you've got all these one-offs that no one knows very much about, but they didn't have the prominence of McPherson or Freeman.
Freeman died at just 55, never outliving his reputation.
Then I wanted to be a top crook and to be known as a top crook. I wanted a reputation. Today I'd do almost anything to lose it.
You are a baddie. You accept that you're a baddie.
I accept I was a baddie up till 16 years ago. I don't think I'm a baddie now.
A medical report before Freeman's death had flagged a host of dangerous signs. He was suffering intense abdominal and kidney pain, struggling with severe stress and high blood pressure, and was complicating his chronic asthma by smoking heavily. According to his widow, Georgina, Freeman also regularly took Valium to calm his nerves. And as the post-mortem noted, his body was covered in scars and needle marks after years of pethidine dependency. Shakespeare wrote, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown." And so it proved for George Freeman, the King of Sydney.